We are looking at a case from the early years of the 20th century. So sit back as we travel to the ancient walls of Caernarfon, where beneath the shadow of the medieval castle, a tragedy unfolded that would shock the close-knit communities of North Wales. When Mary Catherine Evans was born in 1875 in Penrhyn, a town dominated by the vast slate quarries that scarred the landscape of Gwynedd, she was the daughter of Mr. John Evans, who worked as a quarryman, and his wife, Catherine. Life in the town was harsh, shaped entirely by the slate industry that employed nearly every able-bodied man in the area. The Evans family, like so many others, depended completely on the dangerous and exhausting work the quarries provided. In the early 1890s, tragedy struck the family when Mary's mother died after a brief illness. The loss brought a period of deep uncertainty and hardship, and after struggling to manage alone, her father decided it was time for a change. He decided to move the family to Caernarfon, a bustling port town on the Menai Strait, where the economy revolved around the docks and the export of slate to Liverpool and beyond. In 1895, John Evans found work as a dock laborer on Slate Quay, loading the heavy slate onto ships bound for England and Ireland. It was demanding and poorly paid work, but it was steady, and in those days, steady work was everything. In 1897, when Mary was 22 years old, she married Mr. Owen Hugh Williams, a docker some 19 years her senior. Owen was 41 at the time, a weathered man whose years of heavy labor on the quayside had taken their toll on his health. They settled into a small terraced house on Poole Street, in one of the poorest districts near the harbor, where the air was thick with the smell of seaweed and coal smoke, and the cries of gulls echoed from dawn until dusk. By 1900, Mary's father and her younger sister had moved in with them, adding to the already cramped household and increasing the burden on Mary's shoulders. Despite these pressures, she showed remarkable compassion when she adopted a 2-year-old girl named Margaret, known as Maggie, whose mother had abandoned her at the workhouse. The little girl became part of the family, another mouth to feed in a home where money was always scarce. To help make ends meet, Mary rented a room to sailors and dock workers who needed temporary lodging between voyages. She also took in washing from the families of other dock laborers, spending long hours in the cramped back kitchen, scrubbing, boiling, and ironing clothes. Her days were filled with relentless work from early morning until late at night, balancing household chores with caring for her father, her sister, and her adopted daughter. Though her life was hard and physically exhausting, it was much like that of countless working-class families in the port towns of North Wales at the turn of the century, where survival depended on constant labor, and where the fog rolling in from the Menai Strait seemed to carry with it an air of perpetual struggle. Sadly, the marriage between Mary and Owen Hugh Williams did not seem to be a happy one. Owen drank heavily, spending much of his wages in the dockside taverns, and there were long periods when the couple lived apart, though they never formally separated. During one of these periods of separation, Mary met Thomas David Rowlands. He was a rough and hardened man, known locally as Tom the Sailor, or sometimes simply as English Tom, though it was never entirely clear whether he was English by birth or simply by upbringing. He spoke with a plain English accent, and there was nothing that immediately marked him as Welsh. Thomas had served as a merchant seaman, spending years aboard ships that sailed to India, the coast of Africa, and the West Indies. Since leaving the merchant navy, he had drifted between the ports of North Wales, Caernarfon, Holyhead, Bangor, taking on whatever casual labor he could find on the docks, loading cargo, repairing ships, or working as a stevedore when the work was available. Thomas Rowlands would spend time at Mary's house when he was in Caernarfon, and then disappear for weeks or even months at a time, moving between ports in search of work or simply wandering as men of his kind often did. However, in early 1902, Mary gave birth to a baby boy whom she named Thomas John, the same name as Thomas John Rowlands. She registered the father as her husband, Owen Hugh Williams. But at the start of the 20th century, such arrangements were not uncommon. Women often listed their husbands as the father on official documents, even if the biological father was another man. They did this both to avoid the social scandal that would come with an illegitimate child, and to ensure some measure of security and respectability for the child in a society that judged such matters harshly. Thomas Rowlands continued to work his way around the ports of North Wales, periodically returning to Caernarfon to see Mary. From the outside, the relationship was not thought to be particularly serious, and some of the neighbors simply regarded Mr. Rowlands as a casual acquaintance of Mrs. Williams, another drifting sailor passing through the port. In 1907, Thomas Rowlands joined the Royal Navy Reserve and achieved the rank of able seaman. Although not permanent employment, it gave him extra income and a small measure of status, which helped as he continued to drift from one dockside job to another. Mary's husband, Owen Hugh Williams, had by this time separated from her permanently and was living elsewhere in the town. Mary had been left to manage the home and care for her young children largely on her own. She moved to a lodging house on Poolside, a notoriously poor area near the harbor, known for its narrow alleyways, crumbling buildings, and the rough characters who frequented its taverns. But she would often return to stay with her father, who by now lived back in Penryn, a town about 20 miles from Caernarfon. She worked as a street hawker, which was a person who traveled to the market square near the castle and to neighboring villages, selling small goods, fish from the morning catch, ribbons, needles, soap, whatever she could carry. She moved from door to door and set up at local markets, earning a modest income while trying to keep her household together. It was hard, uncertain work, but quite typical of many women in the port towns of North Wales at the time. As Christmas approached in 1909, Mary was living with her children in a lodging house on Poolside, which was kept by a woman named Mrs. Ann Hughes. She had taken up with a man named Evan Price, a docker who worked on the quays. He would stay with her at the lodging house, but did not seem to be deeply involved in the relationship. To him, it was more casual, a convenience rather than anything serious, and he often seemed detached and uninterested whenever others commented on their arrangement. However, on the 20th of December, Thomas Rowlands returned to Caernarfon aboard a cargo vessel that had docked at Slate Quay. He sought out Mary, and despite her living with another man, they were seen together on a number of occasions over the following days, near the docks, in the taverns along the waterfront, walking by the castle walls. Their renewed companionship drew attention, and knowing how volatile Thomas was and the fact that Mary was now with someone else, people in the neighbourhood wondered how long it would be before tensions erupted. On Christmas Day evening, Mary and Mr. Rowlands were seen drinking together at a dockside tavern called the Sailor's Arms. They seemed to be in high spirits, laughing loudly, and later they were spotted walking along the harbour front, arms linked, singing Welsh songs as they made their way toward the quieter stretch of waterfront near the old shipyard. However, they were not seen together for long. Within an hour or so, Thomas Rowlands appeared at the lodging house on Pool's side, where he approached a young docker named Thomas Owen,
and told him that he had a job for him. Mr. Owen replied that he already had work and asked what the job was. Mr. Rowlands said, "I've killed a woman down by the shore, and I want you to go and tell the police." When Thomas Owen looked at Mr. Rowlands more closely, he saw that his hands were smeared with blood, and there were dark stains on the front of his coat.
He said, "Good heavens, killed a woman? Surely not." But Thomas Rowlands insisted, in a calm and measured voice, that he was telling the truth. At Mr. Rowlands' urging, Thomas Owen accompanied him through the darkening streets toward the waterfront. They walked past the castle walls and along the stretch of shore between the docks and the old fortifications, an area where an abandoned shipyard stood, scattered with rotting timber, rusting chains, and the skeletal frames of old boats that had been left to decay. The ground was uneven, covered with piles of slate rubble and large boulders that had been brought in years earlier to reinforce the shoreline. There, between two large moss-covered boulders near the water's edge, Thomas Owen saw the body of a woman lying face down. The tide was beginning to come in, and the water was already lapping at her feet. He stood for a moment in shock, staring at the lifeless form, then looked briefly at Mr. Rowlands before turning and running back along the shore toward the town. He ran breathlessly through the narrow lanes of Poolside, telling neighbors what he had just seen, and then continued on to the police station at Castle Square to raise the alarm. Thomas Rowlands made no attempt to flee. Instead, he walked calmly back along hole-in-the-wall street, moving through the dim, fog-shrouded lanes as though nothing had happened. When Police Constable David Roberts approached him near the castle entrance, Mr. Rowlands stated clearly and without hesitation that he had murdered Mary Catherine Williams. He showed no sign of panic or distress, and after repeating his confession, he was taken into custody without resistance. The officers who spoke with him were struck by how calmly he delivered his words, as though he were reporting an ordinary incident. The seriousness of what he had said was clear to everyone present. At 10:30 that evening, the police went to the stretch of shore between the docks and the castle walls. Although darkness had fallen, and the thick fog was rolling in from the Menai Strait, Inspector William Hughes could clearly see the body of a woman lying among the boulders. The tide was rising steadily, and there was real concern that if they did not act quickly, the incoming water would wash away any evidence that remained at the scene. The combination of the fog, the advancing tide, and the growing crowd of onlookers who had gathered along the harbor front meant that much of the surrounding area had already been disturbed. Footprints had been trampled, and any traces of blood near the water's edge were being steadily erased by the waves. Inspector Hughes noted that the woman was clearly dead, but her body was not yet stiff. He arranged for it to be carefully moved and transported to the mortuary adjacent to Caernarfon prison, while a full investigation began immediately. The police spoke to local residents, many of whom knew both Mr. Rowlands and Mrs. Williams. Several described him as a brutish man who drank heavily and had previously been violent toward her. They said that he was extremely jealous and had been enraged when he learned that she had taken up with another man. One docker recalled that Rowlands had been involved in a drunken brawl at the docks several years earlier and had been brought before the magistrates for assault. A theory soon emerged among some of the neighbors that because of her desperate financial situation, Mary may have been earning money in the dockside taverns by the company she kept, a path that many impoverished women in the early 1900s were forced into, simply to secure food and lodging. This possibility, whether true or not, was believed to have angered Mr. Rowlands greatly. Among the residents living near the place where the body was discovered, none reported having heard anything unusual that night. The sound of the wind and the crashing of the waves against the shore would have drowned out any cries, and the attack appeared to have taken place without anyone hearing a thing. The case of a murder on Christmas Day drew considerable attention, and newspaper reporters soon arrived in Caernarfon from Liverpool and Manchester. One correspondent visited Poolside, where Mrs. Williams had been lodging, and described the neighborhood as a wretched and squalid place, filled with poverty and despair. The authorities were also concerned for the welfare of Mrs. Williams' children. Her young son was taken to the workhouse, and her adopted daughter Maggie was sent to stay with a distant relative in the countryside, away from the scandal and the gossip that now surrounded the family name. On Tuesday, the 29th of December, an inquest was held at the Guildhall in Caernarfon. The prisoner, Thomas David Rowlands, was formally charged with being present at the death of Mary Catherine Williams. The room was packed with local residents, many of whom had known the deceased, and the atmosphere was tense as the proceedings began. The first witness was Inspector William Hughes, who told the court that Mr. Rowlands had confessed while in custody that he had attacked his victim near the water's edge and cut her throat with a knife. Upon learning this, the coroner ordered a post-mortem examination so that Dr. Richard Williams could determine the precise cause of death and document the full extent of the injuries. John Evans, the father of the deceased woman, was called next. He was a frail man of 70 years, his voice shaking as he spoke. He told the court that Mr. Rowlands had threatened to kill his daughter on more than one occasion if he ever saw her with another man. He said that Thomas Rowlands had once grabbed Mary by the arm on the harbour front and threatened her in front of witnesses, and that he had also seen him strike her across the face outside a tavern. Mr. Evans added that his daughter had been afraid of Rowlands but felt she had nowhere to turn. Betsy Roberts was the next witness. She was a poorly dressed young woman who worked as a fish seller near the docks. She said that she last saw Mary Catherine Williams at around 8:15 in the evening on the 25th of December. She said that at that time, Mary was walking away from the Sailor's Arms with Mr. Rowlands, and both of them appeared to have been drinking. She added that before Mary left with him, she had asked her to wait in the same place for half an hour, and explained that she needed to sort something out with him. Asked if she had ever seen Mr. Rowlands be aggressive toward Mrs. Williams, she replied that she had, and that Mary had also told her that Mr. Rowlands had shown her a sailor's rope and a folding knife on more than one occasion, saying that he intended to use one or the other on her if she refused to leave Caernarfon and go with him to another port. Following her testimony, she was questioned directly by Thomas Rowlands, and unsatisfied with her responses, he suddenly shouted from the dock, "That's the woman who caused her death. When I saw her with Mary, I knew it was all her fault. I knew she was bad before, but when Mary was with this woman, I knew she was worse." Some of the newspapers seized upon this outburst as evidence that Mary had been earning money by entertaining men in the dockside taverns, and that Betsy Roberts had encouraged her to do so. And it was this, they suggested, that had driven Thomas Rowlands into a murderous rage. Thomas Owen also gave testimony. He confirmed that about 10 days earlier, Mr. Rowlands had told him that he was going to do for Mary Williams, and had shown him a large folding knife that was attached to his belt by a leather strap. He said that around 9 o'clock on Christmas night, Mr. Rowlands came to the lodging house and said, "Will you come with me? I've got something to show you." He said that they walked together to the shore near the old shipyard, where he saw the body lying between the boulders. He said that Mr. Rowlands was quite calm and told him to fetch a policeman. Evan Price was the next witness. He told the inquest that the deceased had been living with him for the past 2 months at Mrs. Hughes's lodging house. He explained that he had never seen the prisoner, Thomas Rowlands, until Christmas night, when he came to the lodging house looking for Mary. According to Evan Price, Mary had described to him how Thomas Rowlands had shown her a rope and a knife several weeks earlier, warning her that she would face one or the other if she refused to leave Caernarfon and go with him to South Wales or Liverpool. He added that Mary had told him that Mr. Rowlands had made these kinds of threats on more than one occasion, and that she lived in constant fear of him. When asked if Mr. Rowlands knew that he and Mrs. Williams were living together, he replied that he believed he did, as they had been seen together openly around the docks and in the taverns. Inspector William Hughes was called again, this time to read aloud Mr. Rowlands' full confession. But before he did, the coroner asked all the women and children present in the courtroom to leave the room, as he believed the details were too disturbing for them to hear. In his confession, Mr. Rowlands described how Mrs. Williams had eventually met him at the Sailor's Arms on the evening of the 25th of December, noting that she was already drunk when she arrived. He said that they left the tavern together and walked for some time along the waterfront, past the castle walls, before making their way to the stretch of shore overlooking the old shipyard. It was there, according to his own account, that they began to argue. He said that she told him she would never leave Evan Price and that she wanted nothing more to do with him. He said that he grabbed her by the arm, and when she tried to pull away, he drew his knife. After a struggle among the boulders, he cut her throat and left her body near the water's edge. During the proceedings, one of the jurors inquired whether Mr. Rowlands' mental state, particularly given his years at sea and his heavy drinking, could have influenced his actions. However, the coroner explained that such considerations were beyond the scope of the coroner's court, and therefore could not be taken into account in their deliberations. He said that questions of insanity would need to be addressed, if at all, at the trial itself. Before the jury reached a verdict, Inspector Hughes asked permission to mention the situation of the deceased woman's father. He explained that Mr. John Evans was 70 years old and was living in extreme poverty. He said that on Christmas Day, the old man had nothing but dry bread to eat, and he had now come to Caernarfon with no money for food or lodging. He also had a child placed temporarily in his care, and he feared that applying for parish relief might disqualify him from receiving his old age pension. Inspector Hughes added that Mr. Evans was a former soldier, having enlisted in 1867 and served in the Crimean campaign before being sent home unfit for further service after years of hardship. Following this, the jury made a collection for the benefit of the deceased woman's father. Several shillings were gathered from those present in the courtroom, a small but significant gesture of sympathy. Altogether, the proceedings lasted just over 3 hours, and at the conclusion of the inquest, the jury found Thomas David Rowlands responsible for the death of Mary Catherine Williams. He was remanded in custody to await trial for the crime of murder. The following day, Wednesday, the 30th of December, Mary Catherine Williams was buried at Llanbeblig Church, on the outskirts of Caernarfon. Only a handful of mourners attended. The trial began on the 2nd of February, 1910, at the Assizes Court in Caernarfon, presiding over which was Justice Darling. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with standing room only at the back, as the people of the town had followed the case closely since Christmas Day. Even though Thomas Rowlands had confessed to the crime and given a comprehensive statement on how he committed it, when the judge asked him how he pleaded, he replied clearly, "Not guilty." The prosecution was represented by Mr. Ellis Griffith, K.C., a formidable barrister known for his thorough preparation and commanding presence in court. The defense was represented by Mr. Artemus Jones, an experienced advocate who had taken on the case despite its apparent hopelessness. Although much of the evidence came from the same witnesses who had appeared at the inquest, the court heard more detailed testimony from them, most notably from Dr. Richard Williams, who had conducted the post-mortem examination at the mortuary adjacent to Caernarfon prison. Dr. Williams gave a careful and methodical account of the injuries he had found. He explained that the deceased had suffered a deep and violent cut across the throat, which had severed the major blood vessels and caused rapid and massive blood loss. He described additional defensive wounds on the victim's hands and arms, suggesting that she had tried to protect herself during the attack. He also noted bruising on her shoulders and neck, consistent with being forcibly held down. His evidence reinforced the seriousness and brutality of the attack, leaving little doubt as to how violently the deceased had been assaulted. The trial lasted for 1 day, and when the evidence had been heard, Mr. Ellis Griffith, for the prosecution, said only a few words to the jury. He stated simply that the facts spoke for themselves. The prisoner had confessed, witnesses had corroborated the events leading up to the murder, and the medical evidence confirmed the cause of death. There was, he said, little more that needed to be said. Mr. Artemus Jones, speaking for the defense, gave a more considered and impassioned appeal on the prisoner's behalf. He said that it had been suggested by the prosecution that the prisoner had come to the town specifically to find the woman, and having discovered her with another man, had murdered her out of revenge. However, he argued that if the prisoner had truly planned revenge, he would not have waited until Christmas Day to carry it out. He would have acted immediately upon his arrival on the 20th of December, showing clear intention from the moment he stepped off the ship. Mr. Jones claimed that the prisoner had never actually intended to harm the woman, but was driven by a sudden and uncontrollable impulse, a storm of emotion brought on by years at sea, heavy drinking, and the shock of seeing the woman he believed to be his own living openly with another man. He said that this impulse rendered the prisoner unable to govern his actions, and that it was while he was in this deeply disturbed state that he committed the act. He invited the jury to consider the prisoner's behavior immediately after the crime, pointing out that the first thing a sane and rational person would do after committing such a terrible act would be to try and conceal it, to hide the body, to flee the town, to create an alibi. But the prisoner's actions, he said, were not those of a rational man. He had walked calmly to a lodging house, confessed openly to a stranger, led him to the body, and then surrendered himself to the police without hesitation. This, Mr. Jones argued, was not the behavior of a man in full possession of his faculties. It was the behavior of someone who was acting as though he were insane. After a brief pause, he said that if the prisoner was in such a disturbed state of mind that he could not tell the difference between right and wrong, then he could not be held fully responsible for his actions in that moment. And if that were the case, the correct verdict would be that he committed the act, but was insane at the time. When Justice Darling summed up the case for the jury, he reminded them that although there had been no formal medical evidence presented regarding the prisoner's sanity, they were still entitled to consider the man's behavior and the nature of the crime. If those circumstances led them to believe that he was insane at the time of the killing, they were free to say so. However, he said, they must examine the matter very carefully and not allow sympathy or emotion to cloud their judgment. He said that the brutality of the crime did not in itself prove insanity, as many sane people commit violent acts when driven by anger, jealousy, or hatred. He also stressed that showing no remorse or acting calmly after the crime was not enough to demonstrate madness, as many people are cold, callous, and indifferent to the suffering of others without being insane. He reminded the jury that the law required clear evidence of a disordered mind, evidence that the prisoner could not distinguish right from wrong at the moment he committed the act. The jury then retired to consider their verdict. They were absent from the court for only 5 minutes before returning to announce that they found the prisoner, Thomas David Rowlands, guilty of murder. The courtroom fell silent as Justice Darling addressed the prisoner. He said that the jury had considered the matter carefully and had reached the only conclusion that the evidence allowed. He then sentenced Thomas David Rowlands to death by hanging. Some questioned this sentence in the days that followed, arguing that the prisoner had never been formally assessed for insanity by a medical professional, and that his years at sea and his erratic behavior after the crime warranted further examination. A petition was raised to try and get the sentence commuted to life imprisonment. However, there was little interest in this from the local community, and the petition gathered few signatures. Thomas David Rowlands was hanged at Caernarfon prison on Tuesday, the 22nd of February, 1910. The prison stood in the shadow of the great medieval castle, and on the morning of the execution, a small crowd gathered outside the gates. According to those present, his last words before the trapdoor opened were, "The sea took her from me." Mary Catherine Williams' children were placed in care. Her son Thomas was sent to Dr. Bernardo's, a well-known charity that rescued children from difficult and desperate circumstances. Owen Hugh Williams, Mary's legal husband, who had remained silent during the case and never appeared at the trial, did not offer to take the boy, as might have been expected if Thomas was indeed his child. This silence was seen by many as a quiet acknowledgement that the boy's true father had been Thomas Rowlands. Mary's adopted daughter, Maggie, was cared for by a Quaker family in Liverpool, who took her in and gave her a chance at a better life, far removed from the scandal and tragedy that had consumed her early years. John Evans, Mary's father, returned to Penryn, where he lived alone in a small rented room. He received his old age pension, but it was barely enough to survive on. He died in poverty just over a year later, in the spring of 1911, having outlived his daughter by only 16 months. This tragic story unfolded in the shadow of Caernarfon Castle, a monument to power and history. Yet it could do nothing to protect those who lived and suffered in the narrow streets and squalid lodging houses at its feet. The lives of Mary Catherine Williams and Thomas David Rowlands remind us that behind every case there are real people, trapped by poverty, driven by jealousy, and caught in circumstances from which there seemed no escape. As always, feel free to leave any comments or feedback, and I hope to see you all again next time.